Our next speaker is Cheikh Mbow. He is a senior scientist from the World Agroforest Central ECRAF in Kenya, and is also a member of the Scientific Committee of Future Earth. He's a regional expert on disturbance of savanna ecosystems, particularly the impact of bushfires and other land cover change in rural areas.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. My name is Cheikh Mbow, not Mbow. You're not the only one who does not know how to pronounce these African names. I came from the World Agroforestry Center. I'm very glad to be here to share some of my viewpoint on the local impact of all these trends my friend mentioned in African context. And my talk would be about the local impact of large-scale climate change and mitigation in African landscape. A very quick outline. I tried to have a simple presentation that conveys the pictures and evidence of those impacts on the ground and try to analyze the factors, the drivers of those change, and then the responses, because the most important is to know how we are acting on the ground to overcome and respond to those impacts in daily basis in our development agenda. So very quick overview on land degradation in relation to climate change. A second point on importance of non-factors climate, because we are just accusing too much climate when it comes to land use change in Africa, and there are so many other factors which are equally important as stressors and drivers of land use change in Africa. I'm going to touch base on some of these issues to just open up the range of discussion points we may have when it comes to land use change and the impact of global trends. And then the responses. And across all these 3 points, we are trying every time to give you some emerging challenges. What are the main questions which we may ask to ourselves, or research question we may address in order to move these things ahead. You have all seen these pictures showing the trend in rainfall. You have seen that in all regions of Africa, the process of drought is taking place. If you take averages of all this region, that's the picture you may see. But if you just stay in this big picture, using the Palmer Drought Index, using the rainfall decline, the displacement of rainfall from the north to the south, we may not have the full picture, although this is very important to notice. We may not have the full pictures because what is most striking as a problem in West Africa in general, for the particular case, is the interannual variability and the annual variability of climate change. And I want to show you some examples of this variability. Friends from Copenhagen universities try to track the change in NDVI in relation to rainfall in the last 10 years. And what they found is that there is some sort of comeback of the rainfall which is related to an increase in vegetation indices. If you just stick on the long-term trends, which is showing that Africa is drying, you may not capture this type of reversal trend, which can have some implication in the land use. It may be having impact on the pastoral activities, for instance, or the agricultural practices. And in the ground, you can see that issue like transhumance can be affected by this regreening of some of the areas because of improved rainfall. The second point is about this figure we just published some years back, showing that if you do the general trend of rainfall from the beginning of the stationary data collection to 2010, you have a general trend of decrease. But if you try to have this regression on the last years, you have some sort of positive rainfall coming back. So climate change is true because you're having this drought which is increasing in West Africa. But at some period of time, you can feel that there is some improvement in this rainfall pattern. And this needs to be explained. El Nino, La Nina, or name it, all these biological change in land uses can have differential impact from one area to another. At the same time, we have this in West Africa. In East Africa, drought are increasing. In the last 10 years, there is at least 5 or 6 drought periods in Kenya, as an example. And then before I get to the plan, I dreamed overnight that I should show you the change in rainfall pattern in August months. August is the middle of the summer, and that's the months where we're supposed to have the maximum rainfall in the Sahel, for instance. And I took daily data of Ouagadougou, which I'm showing here, and I picked some years, 79, right after the drought of the 70s to 2001. I picked some years, and you have seen that the pattern of rainfall in the months of August is totally variable during this month of August. August is very critical for crop production. If you have a good rainfall in August, you can be sure that we won't have hunger, or the crop production will be much better in general term. And what you see is that for some years, like in 1979, good start in August rainfall, dry spell for 2 weeks. All the crops which were starting to produce something die in 2 weeks. So that's, during that period, you have a serious problem of hunger as a consequence of rainfall variability. For some other years, the dry spell comes in the beginning, it comes back to normal. And this jump can have another effect which we call flooding. It stopped raining at some point, and then out of the sudden, it rains 50% of the total rainfall of the season in 2-3 days, 1 week at best. And this creates the flash flooding you have heard about in the West Africa in general, with some implication in urban areas. So it's quite critical when we talk about trends and impact to not only see the long-term trend, which is useful to have a big picture, but to narrow it down to decadal variability and to narrow it down to daily variability, because all those variabilities have impact on the vulnerability of communities, on the vulnerability of agroforests, agricultural systems. So modeling, this is a backward looking, trying to get the evidence from the past and inform what we are doing now. It's equally important to have a forward looking projection, modeling, knowing where we are going, anticipation. And there is a lot of diversity in the product we are having, but the general observation is that Africa, mostly this region, is getting drier. And I tried to combine this information with the NASA projection of the rainfall in the Sahel. And what you can see is that it has been breaking up and down. The variability has been always there. But from 2020 onward, they project that we are expecting a heavy decline in the rainfall. How do we go about that? If you trust this information, there is so many policy implications on the preparedness of those communities to face this drought system, this drought coming, because it's going to hit all this productive system, irrigation agriculture, rainfall-dependent agriculture, people's need of water. It's going to have many implications on food production. And when we talk about food production here, there's two components which are important for Africa. The one is what you call, famine, when you don't have enough to eat. But the most tedious nutrition-related problem is malnutrition, stunting. It's the hidden hunger. People, you can see them, they look nice looking, healthy, but they don't have all the minerals, the nutrients in their body to sink or to be healthy. And that's a big issue some of these institutions are tackling now because of the lack of diversification and the way people are fed. That's a hidden hunger, which I think is important to mention here. So let's go now, after those impacts, to talk a bit more about the implications. Some pictures, and I want to illustrate what we are talking about. Here, we all know about all these dust plumes, which create some sort of connections between the impact we have in relation to climate change in Africa to other regions of the world, the dust coming to Europe or the dust coming to the US. This is extremely important, and it has so many implications in other lands, environment, and that's something which we can use. A lot of mortality of animals, particularly livestock, breeding in the Sahel in particular. During the 70s drought, we had more than 50% of the total herds died, disappeared, and that has many impact on the wealth of people and the income of people. And I selected this. This is my old son, 10 years, and we went in the outskirts of Dakar. Imagine this area was a huge lake where the French army was doing its exercise. So imagine the level of water before the 70s. This Lac Mbawan, it's called, 30 kilometers away from Dakar, has had totally dry and has to protect his eyes against the dust coming straight into him. And this type of situation where we are losing fresh water bodies is extremely frequent. You know the picture, the iconic picture from the Lake Chad, which is shrinking. And if you do not pay attention, most of this fresh water, which is improving food security because of irrigation, because of fish, and which is maintaining some ecosystem health, and most importantly, refilling the water table for fresh water supply. Those things are the typical example of climate change in West Africa. Another typical point is the issue of erosion. Many people think that erosion is only active and become problematic when it comes to hilly shape sort of landscape. The most serious problem of erosion, at least from my knowledge in West Africa, happens in not very hilly shape landscape, because that's where people are doing cultivation. And when they do cultivation, most of the trees within the landscape are removed because of some belief of intensification. You have to remove the tree, put the fertilizers, have your machine goes through. This is an important cultivation system. The typical cultivation system in West Africa traditionally is agroforestry. It's combining the crops with trees. With colonization, they wanted to have a high yield of cocoa, a high yield of groundnut, burn the tree off the land, and then put fertilizers and feed a demand somewhere. And then what happened is don't have trees, erosion will take place. And these are deep soils sometimes, very good soils. As you can see, this is the Patako area, which is the border between Senegal and the Gambia. And I played trying to use some of my instruments on the laboratory, total station we call it, which the engineers doing the road are using, to measure the volumetry of sediment which are removed in these big holes. I can, as a 2-meter tall person, I can be inside this big hole without being seen from outside. It's so deep. It's about 3-4 meters sometimes deep. And the question I ask my students to try to respond is where all these sediment are going. So we can calculate it easily with our tools, but where are they going? They're going in the rivers. And when they go in the rivers, I'm here sitting in this one. So when they're going in the rivers, what happens is there is a clogging process. All the sediments are deposited in freshwater bodies, reducing not only the level of water, but encouraging also the development of how do you call it in English, plant envahissante, invasive plant, mostly Tifa. So we have so many freshwater bodies in West Africa which are invaded with Tifa. No more fish because it's inaccessible, and it's very difficult for local communities to have a great use of the food stock. These are typical example of this erosion, the water erosion I just showed there, but here is the wind erosion. Imagine these old balanites in Niger, where all these people can sit under the root system. Imagine the quantity of sand which has been removed from these balanites. Very likely, the trees, like human beings, are very resilient in Africa. And that's why this plant can survive still after having a quarter of its roots outside. Dune encroachment, you have seen it many times, and outcropping of some of the soils. This soil becomes very unproductive, even if we have rainfall coming back into the landscape. So these are serious land degradation issues which are important to mention. I talk about flooding, flash flooding, but not only that, the quality of water when you destroy all the vegetation around the catchment, the browning of the water. There was some publication on the browning of the rivers because of the load of sediment and clay, because of all the sediment coming with the rainfall and flowing down to the river, hindering some quality of the water, as you can see here. But there are some higher frequency of extreme events, like bigger rainfall events, which create a lot of flooding issues. And here I have to mention the importance of accounting fire as one of the biggest threats because of the drying conditions which are taking place in West Africa, and that have many impact on the livestock, biodiversity. This is a huge fire in 2005, which I played mapping using MODIS data, because the government was claiming it's only 30,000 hectares. And when using MODIS, we found 370 hectares, 20 times what they think the size was. And you don't know all the impact, not only ecosystems, but also to livelihood of local communities. Soil fertility decline. A lot of studies about that, low yield, but most importantly, the development of parasite plants because of the dry condition. These are the striga, people who work on West Africa know, very known by local communities and very difficult to get rid of. And that creates the reduction of rainfall. So the other impact is when all these conditions are there, the only option for people is to abandon land and gain other land. And the deforestation is taking place. So this is a typical example between 1990 and 2000. In 10 years, all the deforestation in the Kaffrine area has taken place that way because of the extension of the peanut groundnut cultivation in Senegal. You see how it evolved from 1990. It was only cultivated here, but because of the cash associated to groundnut, they have to extend. And because of climate change, they have to extend it to the south. But look at the implications in terms of, this is an African map showing where all this change related to agriculture is taking place, as you can see. Mostly taking place in savanna ecosystem and less in forest ecosystem. But unfortunately, the efforts of maintaining biodiversity, land sparing, the efforts on REDD are concentrated on the forested area. They are not trying to do some efforts into the agricultural area where a lot of deforestation is taking place. And I'll show you another evidence on that. This is the fragmentation effects. If you take, these are the data I took from USGS, and you can see that there is a lot of fragmentation which are taking place in Burkina Faso, for instance. I have this type of maps for Niger, for Mali, and I just want to show you the typical example of Burkina Faso, which is a north-south sort of fragmentation. But if you take the Senegal case, it's a west to the east sort of fragmentation process. That means the climate signal is there, but there is also some human signal, and that's important to combine the two analyses. Importantly, we have also mentioned the issue of human acceleration, increase in demography. The direct implication in Africa is that people are gathering where the resources are. This is the biggest lake of Senegal. It's called Lac de Guerre. And from the last studies we did, from 1973 to 1988, this is the sort of landscape we have. A little bit of agriculture, more wild vegetation around the lake. Very healthy lake, which can provide a lot of water. But later, in 2010, you can see agricultural extraction has dominated, totally dominated. Private comes in, the government comes in, and all together there is a big competition for land, which is extremely serious and can create a lot of conflicts. They're trying to get a platform where people can discuss and share and manage the resources depending to the needs of each of the stakeholders. But still, there is a big risk that all this climate-driven change will bring more conflicts around areas where you have the most important resources. And then the cities are growing, and as an African, there is a way of life. As a citizen living in Dakar, I still want my firewood to come in because I want to cook using firewood. Culturally, that's what you're doing. And all those needs of natural resources are provided by the rural area. And as climate is changing, a lot of immigration is taking place, and people are going in the big cities. That's a reality. The cities are growing more than the natural growth of demographic growth, and the natural resources are extracted heavily in terms of charcoal, wood, or even in overgrazing to sort of have the necessary resources to feed the cities. I talk about the impact on emission, and that's very obvious that Africa's land use emission is very high. But what strikes me is when I use FAO data, is what is going on in terms of forested area compared to the rate of deforestation. Everybody is talking about rate, and they're going to DRC Congo. Obviously, fine. This is nice because they have high forest area and a high deforestation rate. But there are other countries which have a very high deforestation rate with low forest cover. Where is the most serious situation? Are we just concentrating all our efforts on just the healthy forest to protect them in order to sequester carbon? Or we have to be interested in areas where deforestation rate is very high. That's a very big scientific dilemma we have to face. And recently I was reading a paper which was published in Biogeoscience by Valentini et al. 2014, which is saying, careful. They have used a wide range of data on land use and realized that Africa would be a net source of emission, not necessarily a net sink, if we add CH4, methane, and nitrous oxide into the process. And that is very scary, because that will change all the policy and the way we think about Africa in terms of this. One of the last points I want to make before I conclude my presentation is the thinking that Africa has a lot of land for agriculture, and then it's possible to go and buy land grabbing. And I'm happy that Andreas, my friend, did this information and let it available. And to avoid any diplomatic issue, I use the USA example. I'm in Europe. And if I'm in USA, I use a Europe example to travel back safely. Anyway, this is the case of the US, where they're going to buy land and to do their production. And you see only in tropical areas. In this side, you have seen a lot of African countries. If you take the Arabic case, United Arab Emirates, it's the same thing. All the wealthy countries, they go to tropical areas, and mostly in Africa, to produce many kind of things. Bioethanol product, commodities, wheat for the population. China comes for whatever product they want. And the problem is, if we sell all these lands, which are the basis of our adaptation strategy, Africa will never adapt to those local impact. So bioenergy is one example I show is here, the impact of Jatropha. The importance of non-climate factor. Just one word, the mining sector is extremely important in West Africa. The price of copper has increased, and people are going to mining, and mining has a lot of impact on land use. Not only directly because it destroyed the land, but also it diverts labor from producing food to come to the mining sector. And these are some typical examples of gold. So some responses, social mobilization, a lot of efforts in social mobilization, youth, etc., to engage people into the land use process, or directly on farm responses, how to improve land reclamation, diversification, practice of agroforestry, to make sure that the population use their land to respond to the own threats which they are facing. This is some typical example of erosion control by plantations or sand dune fixation. And the last one is what you have heard about is the Great Green Wall, which is a Pan-African initiative, which is trying to have a mosaic sort of landscape management approach to develop trees and natural resources management along the border between the Sahel and the Sahara. And I would be happy to discuss more in detail about this initiative. In conclusion, the issues are very complex, and I have not the pretension to cover all the potential impact. It's just a glance of some of them. And the issue of integration is extremely useful. Anticipation is something we need, and try to see the connection between all those factors, the economic factors, the climate factors, and the human factors, are something we must do in order to go around all these questions. Thank you for your attention.